Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is Ukraine War, sort of a news update, sort of an update extra, giving you the greater context into a news story that's just been brought to the fore over the last couple of days, particularly by a very good Guardian investigation. In fact, they're going to be producing some more details on systematic torture from Taganrog that is connected to the case of Victoria Roshchina, a journalist who sadly died in captivity. So we're going to read through this initial thread first to give us the overview and then go into some finer details. So this is a thread by Ina Bak-Iversen. Impossible to read the news about Victoria Roshchina without feeling tremendous pain and anger. Her body returned from Russian captivity in such horrific condition, damaged from starvation and torture, that several DNA tests had to be performed to confirm her identity. Originally, little was known about Russia's illegal imprisonment of Roshchina. She went missing in summer 2023. Russia shared zero information about her abduction for 9 months. Investigations have found she was initially detained in occupied Enerhodar, so that's where the nuclear power plant is, just south of the Zaporizhia reservoir. In February this year, Ukraine received the bodies of 757 victims as part of an exchange. Amongst them was Victoria's body, but it took months to determine this, as the Russians handed over her body labelled as an, quote, unidentified man with, quote, heart disease. Victoria's body arrived without eyes, brain, part of her larynx. An internal pathologist expert told investigative team of the Victoria Project, that these organs were likely purposefully removed to hide the cause of death. In this case, pointing to strangulation and suffocation. Due to the condition of her body, the results of the forensic medical examination remain inconclusive, as it is impossible to confirm the exact cause of death without the missing organs. The official investigation regarding Victoria's death is ongoing. The body showed numerous signs of torture and cruel treatment, including abrasions and hemorrhages on various parts of the body, a broken rib, a neck injury, and possible traces of electric shock on the feet. Yuri Belousov, the Ukrainian prosecutor, told the Victoria Project. Interviews have been conducted with others held prisoner with Victoria, recalling seeing multiple scars on her arms and legs, as well as knife wounds. Quote, she told me they tortured her with electric shocks. She was all blue, weighing only 30 kilograms, and couldn't lift her head. End quote. The Victoria Project was initiated by Forbidden Stories, a large collaboration of media outlets and international journalists collecting stories from particularly Ukrainian POWs and civilians living under Russian occupation. Vital stories revealing Russia's many war crimes. In the many interviews conducted, horrific stories have been uncovered from survivors of abduction and detention by Russian forces and FSB in occupied territories. Torture chambers, electric shocks, brutal beatings, and rape are abuse elements repeated in almost every story. Irina, one of the civilians interviewed who survived Russian abduction and torture, says, quote, they poured water on me before electrocuting me through my fingers and earlobes. They beat me with batons, put a gun in my mouth, and slapped my ear membrane and hit me with an electrical cord. Victoria was first imprisoned in the same place Irina was tortured, and Victoria's body showed signs from the same type of treatment. Victoria later was later sent to the garages in Melitopol, one of the many unofficial torture prisons Russians have created in the cities of occupation. She had been missing several months before the Russians confirmed her captivity, but no more information about where or why. Okay, we're now going to look into the story in a more detailed fashion before casting our opinion on what this all means, really. Now, in The Guardian, there's a good summary. The Victoria Project, numerous signs of torture, a Ukrainian journalist's detention and death in Russian prison. So who was she? She was a kind of fearless journalist, very young journalist, actually, 27. But she was captured in the summer of 2023 near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station. It was at least her fourth reporting trip into the occupied territories. She was, by this stage of the war, the only Ukrainian journalist prepared to risk crossing the front line in order to pierce the information blackout imposed by Russia. She died after a year in detention, aged 27. Information on the circumstances of her death is limited. She was held without charge and without access to a lawyer, and during her detention, her only known contact with the outside world was a 4-minute phone call to her parents a full year after she was taken. Preliminary forensics suggest, quote, numerous signs of torture, according to the prosecutor: burn marks on her feet from electric shocks, abrasions on the hips and head, and a broken rib. Her hair, which she liked to wear long and tinted blonde at the tips, had been shaved. Sources close to the official investigation had also disclosed that the hyoid bone in her neck was broken. It is the kind of damage that can occur during strangulation. However, the exact cause of death may never be known because when the body was returned during the exchange on the 14th of February, certain parts were missing, namely the brain, eyes and larynx. The brain, eyes and larynx. Gee. A war crimes investigation has been opened with a view to prosecuting those responsible. The account, part of the Victoria Project, is part of an investigation into the abduction and systematic torture of what Ukraine believes could be as many as 16,000 of its civilians, the second part of which will be published on Wednesday. Most of those detained are being held without charge. The conditions of their detention constitute a suspected war crime, and evidence is being gathered for eventual prosecutions. The detained are aid workers, journalists, business owners, local politicians, church leaders, and anyone suspected of resisting the invasion. They are being held at more than 180 facilities in the occupied territories and inside Russia itself. And yet, in all the noise around peace talks, they are rarely mentioned. It's a subject Roshchina felt was underreported, and it was the focus of her last mission. The information about her final months has been gathered thanks to more than 50 interviews with survivors of Russian captivity, as well as the families of some of those still held. Legal sources operating inside Russia and the occupied territories have also shared information, as have prison officials who resigned from the service in distress over what they had witnessed. While questions remain, one thing is certain: Roshchina fell victim to the very crimes she had set out to expose. So she was trying to look at these kind of torture practices and cast a light on the very dark world. And herself, unfortunately, she became victim to that which she was trying to expose. It's a really sad story, but I think the juxtaposition between this reality and possibly 16,000 people in a similar situation, the juxtaposition of that and, I'm getting on really well with Vladimir Putin, and it's much easier to deal with him than with Zelensky from the likes of, say, Donald Trump. And you hear that, Mike Walls, the national security advisor to the Trump administration, saying, Ukraine's one of the most corrupt nations in the world, even though it isn't, according to data. But he's saying it is, and casting aspersions on Ukraine and saying nothing about Russia. Russia gets its free pass, and yet this is the reality of what Russia is and what Russia does, right? And this is not mentioned. This is glossed over by the people who appear to want to appease Russia at every conceivable opportunity. Anyway, she was a fearless reporter. It talks about her background here. We're going to join it a little bit later. Colleagues said she was obsessed with work and uncompromising. Quote, she had no life beyond her job, no friends, no partner, but also doing extraordinary work. For her, it was a mission, said Sevil Musaeva, the editor-in-chief to Ukrainska Pravda. She was one of the bravest journalists I met in my career. So anyway, it talks about, what she was doing, what her plans were, and then it goes on to how she finally, in this particular case, got to where she was last known to have been. Musaeva said that on Roshchina's last journey, she was looking for the location of black sites, basements of industrial buildings where Russian security operatives systematically used torture to interrogate civilians or coerce them into false confessions. She was building a list of FSB agents responsible. And this leads us to the Melitopol garages. So Roshchina left Ukraine for the last time on 25th of July 2023, taking a roundabout route into the occupied territories because there was no safe passage over the front line. At 2:09 p.m. that day, her phone connected to a Polish mobile network. From Poland, she travelled through Lithuania and north into Latvia. A photo of her passport and her entrance form obtained by this investigation suggests she entered Russia from Latvia under her own name via the Ludonka border crossing. The card states she was heading to the city of Melitopol. She travelled 1,000 miles south through Russia, crossing into occupied Ukraine a few days later. On the 3rd of August, just a few days into her trip, her father, Volodymyr Roshchin, raised the alarm after realising she had stopped checking in on her online messaging accounts. Information he has gathered together with the accounts of 3 people held with Roshchina at a notorious prison in the Russian coastal town of Taganrog, just inside the Russian border, points to what happened next. One of the witnesses was her cellmate, who was released last September and recorded her testimony on video for the prosecutor. She has asked not to be named to protect herself and her family. Roshchina appears to have rented an apartment in Enerhodar, the dormitory town next to the Zaporizhzhia power plant. She paid in advance for 3 nights and, leaving her backpack behind, went out to search for black sites. The journalist told her cellmate she thought she had been spotted by a drone. A police car arrived and she was taken to the police station, a 5-storey building covered in pockmarked blue tiles where the windows are reinforced with metal grills. She was held there for several days before being moved 80 miles south to Melitopol. The name translates as City of Honey, and the area is famous for its cherry orchards. During the occupation, it played a far darker role. Quote, in Melitopol, there is a big concentration of FSB and they have these temporary detention centres, said a European intelligence official familiar with the situation in the occupied territories. In a process known as filtration, the FSB triages captives depending on how valuable it deems them to be. Roshchina is likely to have been considered a special case given the information she was gathering. The prosecutor believes she was taken to a black site in Melitopol known as a garages, and according to her cellmate's testimony, Roshchina later recounted how she was tortured there. Her body was covered in bruises. Quote, during interrogations, they used electric shocks. She got stabbed a few times. I saw them on her. Her arm for sure, leg too. Fresh knife scar. Forearm, soft tissue between wrist and elbow. A scar of roughly 3 centimetres pierced through. She said one guy, she called him a jerk, was brutal, unhinged. On her leg, above the heel, I saw that too, 5-centimetre wound. She said, I told them not to touch my leg. I begged them not to touch that wound. Towards the end of 2023, Roshchina was told by an FSB officer she named as Maxim Moroz that she would be transferred to another prison and was promised better treatment there. According to witnesses, she was transported alone by jeep to Taganrog. Here, she was detained at a pre-trial detention centre known as CISO 2. Quote, she arrived fully pumped full of unknown drugs, said a second detainee who encountered her at Taganrog, who cannot be named for security reasons. Quote, she arrived and she basically started to go crazy. The Guardian will publish a separate, detailed account of the abuses inflicted on Ukrainians held at Taganrog. The conditions there were among the worst seen at any of the many detention facilities operated by Russia. Ukrainian intelligence has recorded 15 fatalities at the prison based on information from released troops. In the torture rooms, soldiers and civilians were waterboarded, beaten and shot in an electric chair. When outside their cells, they were forced to adopt a stress position known as the swan. Bent forward with their hands clasped behind their back at chest level. Food was severely rationed, with 4.5 spoonfuls per plate, according to one detainee who counted. For Roshchina, the effect was catastrophic. She stopped eating. Quote, we would talk to her, but she was lost in her head, eyes terrified, recalled the first witness, her cellmate. Roshchina would lie curled up fetal on the floor, behind a curtain that screened the toilet, out of sight of the guards. Her weight dropped to 30 kilograms, less than 5 stone. She would stand up, but only with me helping, as she was in such a state that she could not even lift her head off the pillow. I would prop her up and she would grab the top bunk to pull herself upright. Her cellmate said. Yevgeny Markovich, a soldier now in rehabilitation in Ukraine after a prison exchange, said she did not officially declare a hunger strike. She simply began to refuse food. He said he saw her once but heard her most days as she was held near to him in cell 115. Quote, at first she explained it by saying that it was for religious reasons, fasting or something. Then she began to say she could not eat for health reasons. Roshchina's feet and legs swelled, according to her cellmate's testimony. She was offered heart pills, but appears to have refused these. Heart problems and fluid retention in the leg tissues are both signs of starvation. In June, she was carried out on a stretcher and spent several weeks at a hospital in Taganrog, where, according to witnesses, she was watched over by 6 masked guards armed with machine guns. The level of security and the efforts made to keep her alive suggest Moscow saw her as a valuable negotiating pawn. In July, she was reportedly sent back to Taganrog with an IV drip in her arm. It seems she continued to refuse food. The head of the prison asked her cellmates what she liked to eat, and separate meals were cooked for her. Witnesses say she was offered bananas and sweets. In April 2024, her family had received the first official confirmation that Roshchina was alive. In a letter from the Russian Defense Ministry, it stated that she, quote, has been detained and is currently in the territory of the Russian Federation. Colleagues began pulling strings. A message was sent to the Vatican, where Pope Francis, who had been able to communicate with Russia through back channels, agreed to ask her name to be added to the prisoner exchange list. Word eventually reached her editor that she was to be released. Towards the end of August, Roshchina was allowed to phone home. Her parents were told by Ukrainian negotiators she was on hunger strike. They kept their mobile switched on all day, waiting for her call. When she finally came on the line, Roshchina was speaking in Russian. Quote, I was promised that I would be home in September, she told them. Her father urged her to eat. Then she said her farewells. Well, that's it. Bye, Mum. Dad, I love you. But she was missing from the exchange that she was supposed to be on. We join it later where it says, we asked a girl from a cell to help her go down. With her help, she went down and they were supposed to exchange her. After that, a security officer came and said that the journalist never made it to the exchange. The officer added, it's her own fault. Some weeks later, the deputy head of Russia's military police wrote to Roshchina's father to say she had died on the 19th of September. When her body was eventually returned, it was in such a bad condition that visual identification was difficult. However, attached to her leg, examiners found a tag in the handwritten inscription VV Roshchina, and the DNA test was a match with her parents. Her father, in his grief, refuses to accept she is gone. He has requested additional examinations, and he has continued to write letters, including to Taganrog, demanding information. The CISO director, Alexander Stoda, has replied twice, claiming Roshchina was never there. His most recent response in January stated she is not and was not listed in the databases. In November 2022, Roshchina described what motivated her. She had been given an award for courage by the International Women's Media Foundation, but she did not want to stop work to attend the ceremony in Los Angeles and so sent a message hailing her colleagues. Quote, we have remained faithful to our mission to convey the truth to the world, countering Russian propaganda, she said. Unfortunately, many journalists have died. I want to dedicate this award to them. After all, they died in the fight for the truth, trying to record Russian crimes. I thank them. So I guess the questions are, to parse it down, so what? I don't mean that in a kind of harsh way for the horrors these people are and have suffered and are suffering. But, what do we learn from this and where do we go? So let's take the first question first. What do we learn from this? Well, we have the confirmation that, in simple terms, Russia are the bad guys. Russia as a nation consistently commits war crimes. They do this in all sorts of different contexts, and we should have absolute clarity now as to who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. There is no parallel when we compare Russia to Ukraine in terms of how they're prosecuting this war. Whether it be with the drones and missiles they are sending against each other, where Russia routinely sends drones and missiles against civilian targets. Whether it be the execution of POWs on the battlefield, where Russia is executing has now been caught on camera executing well over 150 POWs at different points during this war. Whether it be the detained prisoners, and some of these aren't, as you can see, prisoners of war in the sense that they're not soldiers. This is here a journalist that we're talking about who has been imprisoned and tortured and eventually dies in Russian captivity. These horrors are something that are perpetrated far more frequently on the Russian side than the Ukrainian side. to such a level that there is a categorical difference between Russia and Ukraine. So that's the first thing we learn. And then, what do we do? Well, the first thing we learn, I mean, that's the most important point of the most important conclusion here is that Russia routinely commit war crimes to the point that they appear systematic and people should be brought to account. But that's where we go from here. So what now part of this is, okay, evidence needs to be collated to hold these people accountable, and international law should kick in, and these people should be found guilty in the International Criminal Court in The Hague, so on and so forth. So there's that element. But the what now as well needs to also pertain to the information spaces. And I would argue, as we have seen with the Russian propagandists on national television, like with their genocidal rhetoric, these horrors should be displayed and discussed on national television, particularly in America. I talked about this recently and said these Russian propagandists that are spewing this insanely disgusting rhetoric need to be played on national television in the United States. And someone came on the threads like, well, why don't you ever talk about this happening in the UK? Why is it always the United States, not the UK? Well, because the United Kingdom has one of the most bipartisan cross-society support for Ukraine in Europe, in the world. Right? We are, broadly speaking, the UK wholly behind defending Ukraine. There is no illusion in the UK that Putin is some good guy, that actually we should be appeasing Russia. So therefore, we don't really need to be displaying these horrors on national television, although it's always useful to keep that fresh in our minds. But the United States is compromised in its information spaces. You've got Fox News and Newsmax and OAN. You've got these online sources like Tucker Carlson and Elon Musk and David Sacks, and people that are spreading disinformation that are ruining the information spaces in the United States, such that people's opinions have turned against Ukraine and in favor of Russia. And that should not jive with this data. You can't be a human being with any kind of moral compass and see this stuff and go, yeah, do you know what? Russia are the good guys and Ukraine are the bad guys. And so therefore, it is important that the United States is one of these countries where this kind of information should be amplified with a megaphone. So what now? Take this information, share it, and amplify it, particularly in the United States, so that people are very cognizant as to what Russia have been doing during this war and continue to do. That people are cognizant of the systematic nature of torture, how it is used by the Russian war machine, and that the fish rots from the head. Do you know those who are most culpable for this? Yes, we can argue about, we can seek to hold these actual torturers and soldiers and FSB agents who are doing this stuff accountable, absolutely, as we should. But ultimately, we need to be looking to the fish head to see, who is accountable right up at the top of the hierarchy. So that's kind of what we need to be doing now, is amplifying and holding people to account. And hopefully the more that this is amplified, the more the Russians realise that this is working against, not in their favour. But to be honest, I don't think the Russians would care, and they would dismiss this out of hand. But these stories are heartbreaking, they're disgusting, and they show a real appetite, I think, within the Russian security services for despicable behaviour. The question then is, and we talked about this ample times on the channel, is there a categorical difference between Russia and Ukraine in terms of almost like the DNA of the people? We often hear that, Russians lie, and I don't like to tar an entire nation with one brush, but is there some kind of cultural endemic issue whereby the Russians is just far more likely to do, to carry out actions like this than the Ukrainians? Can we reasonably conclude that Russia not only just here are the bad guys, and in this war they're the bad guys and Ukraine are the good guys, but actually there's something more fundamental about their national character that means that this kind of activity is far more likely always with them? Is this a societal learnt thing, or does it go sort of deeper than that? How do we unpick this? How does Russia rehabilitate from a position whereby this is how they go about doing things? You would hope that as a nation they can rehabilitate to a point of not having to do despicable things on a routine basis. How long does that take? How do you unpick that? What are the root causes? Anyway, stuff to think about there. But I just thought I'd do a little bit of a deep dive into this particular case. But remember that this is one of many cases. When they talk about 16,000 people could be or could have been in somewhat similar predicaments to Victoria Roshchina here. This is good reporting by The Guardian, and I look forward to seeing the next report that they reference there. And I could go back to this original thread and talk through the details of all these other people who have equally suffered, and then how it pertains to Victoria's own experiences and those people who have been interviewed alongside this investigative report or for this report, and their accounts. There's a lot more depth we could go into this, but suffice to say that these are horrific accounts of Russian torture and essentially murder of people under their jurisdiction. Let me know what you think in the thread below. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.